Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding. I'm an author, but I also run the centre. And today I'm joined by someone from the publishing world. So please meet Daniel Seaton, who works for a very interesting publisher in the UK called the Pushkin Press. So hello to Daniel.
Hello, thanks very much for having me on. It's very
So
exciting.
many people who are, keen on fantasy could imagine themselves working in the world of publishing fantasy books and other kinds of books. So how did you, as a young man, actually get into publishing? What was your route?
Well, I suspect it's quite a common route, really. At university, I studied French and philosophy. So I came out of university without an obvious. There was no obvious career path for that degree necessarily. So I had to think about what do I really love, and what I really loved was reading and books, and had done since for all my life, really, all my life that I can remember. And so I started working in publishing, and because of I've been studying a language at university, it seemed natural to go into the area of publishing that focuses on translations, which is what I did. And after a few years, I ended up at Pushkin Press. That's coming up for 12 years now. 12 years ago that I came here, and now I'm an editor. And in that time, we've really gone from strength to strength. It's been a great place to work.
So what is the place of fantasy within the raft of things that you publish at Pushkin?
Well, we don't specialize in publishing fantasy. We're not that sort of publisher, but I think there are elements of fantasy in all of the different strands of what we publish. So what we originally were founded to publish, and what we were best known for, is translated classic literature from across the world, and that was what we were publishing when we were first founded in 1997. But since then, we've really broadened out, and now we publish a lot of contemporary literature, as well as we have a children's list and a crime and thrillers list as well. And I actually acquire and publish across all of those lists. And I suppose there's fantastical elements in lots of those titles and lots of those imprints, but really it's the children's list which has the largest element of fantasy in it, and the one that actually I think I enjoy acquiring for the most. It's something that I'm starting to focus on. Yeah, we publish a lot of wonderful fantasy novels from all over the world on that list.
So perhaps you could give the listeners an idea of what some of those titles might be that fall into that category.
Well, for example, I think the most successful title on our children's list since we founded it has been a Dutch classic called The Letter for the King by an author called Tonke Dracht. It's a wonderful. I mean, it's fantasy in the sense that it's set in not in our world, but it's a fantasy, perhaps a bit like Game of Thrones, purely in the sense that the fantastical, magical elements are quite downplayed. So it's quite a realistic fantasy, which I think is quite Dutch, really. It's a very taut, fast-paced adventure story about a young squire who wants to become a knight, and to do that, he has to deliver a letter to the king of a far-off land, and there are all these other knights trying to stop him. It's really just a breathless story, and it's a huge classic in the Netherlands, across the world, and we published it with great success in the UK, and it was recently adapted by Netflix for a brilliant series as well. So that's one example. Another example would be another book from the Netherlands, actually. It's interesting because when I speak to people from the Netherlands, they often say that fantasy is something that is quite lacking from Dutch literature in general. It's often very realistic, but I think perhaps because of that, when a Dutch fantasy novel does emerge, it's often very special, and that's the case for a book called Lampy that we published a couple of years back by an author called Annette Sharp. It ended up being the first translated book to be shortlisted for the Carnegie Medal in the UK. and that's a wonderful gothic secret garden-esque fantasy novel about a young girl with mermaids and pirates, and it's very rich and astute on the level of character as well. Like the Sink, that was a big influence for Annette when she was writing it. Like, I really love that book, and we've got her next book come out this autumn, which is called The Girls, which is a collection of stories actually.
I mean, the reason we got to know each other is that you very kindly were sending me some of these wonderful books to review. Yes. And I remember that one very much. But the one that I remember, of course, is My Favorite Ape.
Oh, The Murderer's Ape. Yeah. I almost didn't mention that because it's so, I mean, that is, I think, perhaps my favorite book that we've ever published across all of our imprints. It's so amazing. It's the author is Swedish, and it's like a very rich, old-fashioned kind of 1920 set adventure in a kind of Tintin-esque style. And the one fantastical element of it really is that the protagonist is a gorilla called Sally Jones, who she can't speak, but she can understand everything that humans say, and she is alongside humans in their world, and she actually works as a mechanic on board a boat, which enables her to sail around the world and have lots of adventures. And it's really just an amazing, richly detailed adventure of the type that I think we don't see enough of these days. And it's beautifully illustrated as well. It has about 100 gorgeous, detailed illustrations by the author in it. And we're publishing the paperback edition of the sequel, Sally Jones and the False Rose, this autumn, which is another just as good as The Murderer's Ape, and in which Sally Jones comes to Glasgow, in fact. So it's UK based. The only reason I didn't mention that right away is because the only fantastical element, if you could call it that, is that she's a gorilla, which is, and
it does an extremely good, it does an extremely good job of persuading you that it's a historical adventure.
Yes,
and you have to actually take a step back and think, hang on a minute. Would a gorilla really be able to be a mechanic? Is this not actually a form of animal fable in a way? And it is actually, I'll put my hand up. It's when anyone says, what's your favorite children's book you've read in the last decade? It's that one. I absolutely adore it. The other thing I like about both that and the Lampe story and others is illustration, because it struck me that whereas in the UK you might get chapter vignettes or whatever, it's quite rare for a publisher, unless you're doing an illustrated book of the sort of children, younger end of the market, people don't spend on the illustrations, whereas the European editions that you're translating seem to have the most wonderful place for illustrations. Am I right in thinking that? Is that something that you've noticed?
Yes. I mean, well, in the case of those two books, the authors did the illustrations as well. So, and Annette Sharp, for example, and I think both Annette Sharp, author of Lampe, and Jakob Wegelius, author of The Murderer's Ape, they started out as illustrators before they, started writing these novels for children. So, so the illustrations came with the novels. It was already a package. But it's true. I think in the UK we have this culture whereby we have picture books for younger children, and then there's a cutoff, and you have novels for around about 7 or 8, where you start having novels with not so many pictures in them. Whereas on the continent in Europe, I see more of a continuum with perhaps they're just text getting longer and longer, and the picture taking slightly more of a backseat. But there's still that mix, like all the way through. Something we could learn from, definitely.
I mean, it's not to say there isn't a place, because obviously there's a whole new range of graphic novels where the balance is obviously towards pictures and what have you. But it does seem as though for sort of common or garden novelists like me, that I'd love to have more opportunity to work with illustrators in that middle group, the middle grade book. Because when you think of the fantasy greats like I don't know, Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe. It's in my head. I can't separate it from the Pauline Baines line drawings. And of course, Tolkien himself was his own best illustrator. And we all know, if I said, oh yes, Smaug on the treasure heap, everybody knows what I'm talking about. So I think that the example coming in from Europe is one that I'd love to see more frequently used. Really, give illustrators some jobs. That's what I'm saying. So what do you think are the main shifts in publishing, particularly as regards fantasy? I mean, I'm talking across the board, because we don't just do children's fantasy. We're looking through the whole range of ages on books. Where is it going at the moment in 2022?
Well, that's a big question. And as an editor, I'm not a specialist in fantasy per se, so it's not my whole focus. But it seems to me like one of the most interesting developments in fantasy literature is kind of linked to one of the biggest trends over the past few years in publishing, which is just bringing in a more diverse range of voices. And I think that the effect that has in fantasy is that we're seeing all these fantasy worlds with just different kind of cultural flavors to them that is so exciting and so interesting. I think perhaps because of the great success of Tolkien and other authors like that, almost got to thinking that fantasy means this medieval magical world, whereas in fact what we're getting to experience now is all these fantasy worlds influenced by different cultures and different mythologies and beliefs and histories, which I think is really exciting. We published a Japanese fantasy novel on our list a few years back that was very successful, called The Beast Player by Naoko Uehashi. And I think that what people really responded to, and that is that the fantasy world was just so richly imagined and detailed, but not in a way that Western fantasy readers are necessarily used to. It's really fascinating.
I can remember the experience of watching Spirited Away. You know, that wonderful Japanese film from, I think it's now from the early 2000s, or it's quite old now anyway, or late 1990s. I remember watching this thinking, I have not seen this before. There is nothing here that I've seen before. The imagery, the pacing, everything was just delightfully different and appealing. So I agree with you. It's very good to have the formulas shaken up. Well, the formulas exploded because new things are coming in. And when we're teaching people on our fantasy course, one of the very first things we're looking at is what's in your own background and the place you live, your own stories that haven't been used before. And it's really exciting if someone comes up with, oh, well, I'm from a Native American background, or I'm from Australia, or whatever. You get new ideas coming through, which is, that's what we're about. We're about new creativity. So what about the different flavors of fantasy from different countries that you see? Because I mean, I can say in crime, like we all know about Scandi noir and cozy crime from the UK and so on. So you can sort of say there are different flavors in the sort of crime and detective world. What would you've mentioned Holland or the Netherlands a couple of times. Do you feel there are sort of different flavors you're getting from different parts of the world as they come across your desk in translation?
Yes, well, it certainly seems that some countries have got very rich traditions that I enjoy delving into. I mean, because I did French at university, I suppose that it's so natural that I end up reading quite a lot of French fantasy submissions, and the breadth of the imagination is really impressive. It's very very creative.
Do you have a recommendation for someone wanting to sort of dabble in French fantasy? Is there anything that
No, I do. I mean, a series that actually I tried to acquire, but wasn't able to, by Christelle Dabo, which actually is very I think one of her main influences Miyazaki. But she I'm trying to remember. Let me just Google what the English translation of the series was. I think it's the Mirror Walker series. I think all 4 volumes of this series have been published in English now. And the first one is called A Winter's Promise. Yes, A Winter's Promise. The Mirror Visitor, that's what it's called. The Mirror Visitor series. And they are YA, a sort of steampunk YA, very influenced by Miyazaki, set in a kind of, well, to begin with anyway, a kind of steampunky Versailles fantasy world full of backstabbing and plotting and intrigue. And it's sort of seductive, but at the same time very cruel and quite a scary place. I absolutely loved it. I really recommend those. I think that's a great example of the kind of originality that French fantasy writing can offer.
Yes, and going back to the Dutch experience, you very recently sent me, is it The King of the Copper Mountain?
Oh yes, by Paul B.
Yeah, which is obviously a classic work, but that's something I have found myself recommending to particularly parents with children who are just learning to get secure in reading, because it has an element of repetition. But also what's really interesting about that is the good-heartedness of it. It's definitely something where you feel, oh, this is a really lovely, kind world. You've got sort of wonderfully absurd things happening, like a series of bees turning up and telling a story, and a dragon who gets hatched in the stables. So, but it's not. It doesn't follow, because it's a series of stories. It doesn't sort of follow a conventional pattern. You're always surprised by it.
Yes. Yeah,
So
I think that's what's interesting about it, and what makes it so. One of the reasons why it's been so popular, because it's just so perfect for reading aloud. I think with children, which I think is so important. I think that's why I fell in love with reading in the first place, as being read to aloud, and and not just picture books. My mum and I would read novels together, and this is a novel for, I'd say, 7+ children, but one that you could just have great fun reading aloud at bedtime, and it's split into these little chapters, self-contained. And as you say, it's so gentle and warm, and there's just this feeling of goodness about it that is really appealing.
Absolutely. And wonderful role model for an older king. I actually made a list of top 10 fantasy royalty over the Queen's Jubilee weekend, and that came in on my list because I thought that's a really nice version of a king, someone who everybody's welcome. We'll fit you in somewhere in the house. So if you were going to look back at, remember yourself as a child, what were your go-to books, perhaps fantasy books maybe, that inspired you on the path? You mentioned that you read together with your parents, but what's your favorites from back then?
Well, so many really. I really enjoy thinking about those times, because I just loved, I just fell in love with reading quite early on, and there were so many amazing books for me to discover. I think probably one of the first books that I read, and probably the first fantasy book that I read was The Hobbit, by Tolkien, which just kind of blew me away. And I was pretty soon I was like running around the playground at school trying to get people to play it, being like elves and dwarves and hobbits with me, and became obsessed, and and read The Lord of the Rings. And then I think that just gave me a taste for all things magical. And I read so many classics really that I just loved, by authors like Diana Wynne Jones and Penelope Lively, The Ghost of Thomas Kemp, also an Oxfordshire-based book, I think. Alan Garner, The Weird Stone of Brisingamen and the sequels. And then I really got into Brian Jack's The Redwall books.
Oh, yes.
I was very...
Yes, those are animal fables, aren't they, for those?
Yeah,
who may not have come across them.
yeah, they're kind of like Sylvanian Families meets Braveheart, kind of about this all set around Redwall Abbey, which is like an abbey in the middle of a sort of bucolic landscape, populated by these lovely woodland animals like mice and moles and rabbits, and they're invariably besieged by an army of rats and foxes and all the scary woodland animals, basically. And it would culminate in a big battle, and I just couldn't get enough of them. I must have read, I don't know, read them many, many times. And then another author that I think I moved on to because he also had the had mice as the stars of his stories was Robin Jarvis. I don't know if you're familiar with his Deptford Mice books, and also the Whitby Witches. Yeah. Oh, I absolutely love those. They're very different from Redwall in the sense that they are much more magical, much darker and scarier. I mean, I think you could call them horror, really. There are some really frightening moments, some really tragic moments too. A real sense of magic and otherworldliness about them that I can sort of still feel now when I think about them. And that's something that the scariness and the darkness that I found in those books is something that I think is quite rare actually to find in children's books. Something that I loved and something that I think perhaps there should be more of. We're publishing a Finnish children's novel this autumn. It's called History of Raspberry Hill, and it's a gothic mystery set in a sanatorium in a snowy Finnish forest in the 1920s, and it's about a young 12-year-old girl who gets sent there to recover from tuberculosis, but she soon discovers that there are some mysterious goings on at this sanatorium, and she tries to get to the bottom of them, but well, I'm not going to spoil it for you, but it doesn't all go well, and it turns out to be quite a dangerous and scary place. And I heard the author of that, Eva France, she talked quite eloquently about how it's important to write scary stories for children, because when a child is reading a story, they're in control of what they're imagining and what they're picturing in their mind's eye, and they can sort of make it as scary or as or tone it down as much as they want, or they can stop when they want and go on when they feel ready. It's not like when you're being assaulted by images from a TV screen, for example. So yeah, and I agree with her. I think scary children's books, there should be more of them. And then on my journey, I suppose, well, I could sit here forever listing all of the children's books that I loved, but when I was 11, I think was when Northern Lights came out by Philip Pullman, and that just blew my mind as well. Like I never read anything like that before. I remember taking it on holiday, and it was just incredible. I think it had all of the magic and adventure that I was used to and sort of addicted to by that time, but it also just had all this such depth and all these new ideas and references that led me down new paths. And also I loved something that really sort of sparked my imagination was this this idea of alternate worlds, the idea that things could be different, if only for just some small changes here and there. We could be living in a completely different world, and that's once you realize that, it sort of opens the door to thinking about so many more fascinating things.
It is interesting that the modern, well, they've been around since early in the 20th century, but the sort of multiverse concepts have always existed in fantasy, with the Underhill, the world of the Fae, and the traveling between worlds has happened. We obviously traditionally we all knew something, didn't we? Because it's always been there in story. It just took the physicist a while to figure it out. So
it makes me think of another great classic that I loved when I was a kid, The Wolves of Willoughby Chase by Joan Aiken, which I didn't even realize at the time was like an alternate history, but it is, isn't it? It's like it's an England where the Glorious Revolution never happened. So it's like a Catholic England, which I think went over my head, to be fair, when I first read it. But yeah, it's interesting.
Joan Aiken I remember reading, she had one of the things that she does is really great titles for her books. And I think she perhaps has been a little bit forgotten. I remember there was a collection of stories of her called The Necklace of Raindrops, which I kept borrowing again and again from the library because I just loved the title more than anything else about it. And again, with illustrations. I've got several of hers on my classic children's bookshelf over in the other room. So what about now? And you don't have to confine yourself to children's books. What's your top read of the last decade, would you say?
Oh, a fantasy novel. I find it quite hard to. I mean, I read what was Susanna Clarke's new book called?
Piranesi.
Piranesi last year, which I loved. I thought that was just almost impossibly mysterious and intriguing, and like really paid off in the end. And I guess that reminded me. This is probably more than a decade ago now that Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, yeah, that's the one, came out. That was that. I thought that was really striking. Just the sense of weirdness and otherness, and like menace that she gave her magical environments is really distinctive and like really stayed with me.
I think both her and Margaret Atwood show how you can do fantasy within a literary fiction tradition. Because quite often fantasy gets hived off into genre fiction.
Yes.
And people who sort of self-select, they don't go and bother to look what's on the shelf if they don't like, dwarves and elves and things. But both of those writers have found a route which is respectable as far as the literary establishment is concerned. It's quite fascinating, really, the politics of that.
Yes.
So tell us about the Pushkin Press. If you don't sound like a publisher who invites submissions. You go out and find things in translation that have already been published. Is that how it works for you?
Well, no, we for a start, we don't only publish books in translation. So we do publish English language original stuff as well. In terms of how we get our submissions, I mean, sometimes they're submitted to us by agents. A lot of the time, they come from translators who do a really valuable job in not just in translating books, but in finding them and championing them, and in often they're the ones who have the first idea that this book deserves to be read in English. And then there's a good amount of just kind of rummaging around and finding things, which is very enjoyable.
And before your colleague gets deluged with unsolicited submissions, anyone listening to this who has a manuscript, do go and read what they want on the Pushkin Press website rather than just send it in, because it can be a bit of a nightmare for the editors if things come at them from all over.
Yes.
So, Daniel, I don't want to get your colleague in trouble. But Daniel, when we finish our podcast, we always have a section where we have a little think about where in all the fantasy worlds that we've met, be it in books or on film or wherever, would it be the best for something? And we've done all sorts of different subjects, from where's the best place to get a magical sword, or best place to go down the pub. But with you, I thought, where's the best place to be a publisher? Now, I think we probably have to expand the definition to include bookseller or book creator. Otherwise, we might be very limited on our choices. But have you had a chance to think where you would like to sell books? In which fantasy world?
I was trying to think about, I was trying to think of literary locations in fantasy worlds. It was quite fun. Something that came to my mind was Terry Pratchett, Ankh-Morpork, and the library, actually, the Unseen University, that has that amazing orangutan librarian and is full of all sorts of magical grimoires, etc. so that came to my mind. And also, if you don't mind me plugging another one of our books that's coming up this autumn, there's a wonderful German fantasy title called Bramble Fox by an author called Catherine Tordassi. We're publishing it this autumn, and it's, even though the author is German, it's set in Britain, in Wales, and it's really informed by British mythology and actually a lot of the classics that I've already mentioned. She has a real love for those too, so it's really interesting to see those reflected back by a German author. It's brilliant. I think people will really love it. But one of the protagonists of that book is called Ben, and he's a young Welsh boy who works in a bookshop with his mum. And so what I really like about the story is that he's having this amazing magical adventure. He goes through into the fairy world, encounters all sorts of peril, and he's experiencing it and viewing it through the lens of Tolkien and all these other classics that we've been talking about. So he's kind of seeing this story through the prism of these books that we already love, which I think is really interesting. And anyway, in this fantasy world, he finds an amazing, again, a library, a place called World's End, which is a kind of like a skyscraper driven down into the earth, just full of endless new books for him to read, which is like his idea of heaven. I thought that was such a lovely idea. I really enjoyed it. As for where it would be good to be a publisher or bookseller, well, that's a bit tricky.
I think for me, I would really like to. It's probably a lot of our listeners are shouting this out at us. I'd quite like to be in Diagon Alley and have a bookshop down there, one that doesn't get blasted by Death Eaters. But yeah, that sounds quite fun.
That's a great answer.
But that's where I would pick. Well, thank you so much, Daniel, for talking to us and giving us a publisher's perspective, and particularly bringing to our attention the books that we may not be aware of because of a English language bias that happens. And we'll put a link to the press in the show notes. People can go and check out what the Pushkin Press gets up to. But so thank you very much for joining us, and look forward to reading more of your books, hopefully for review.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's been great fun.